According to the theory of evolution, as based on archaeological and genetic evidence, science has concluded that about 4 million years ago, the first human came into existence. He came from a family of animals known as apes, and has morphed several times into different kinds of creatures who became less and less ape-like and more like humans. It's believed that the first transition away from an ape is the creature called Australopithecus, who was the first ape who could walk upright on two legs. However, this species was small and had a small brain. About 1 million years later, a new creature came upon the scene who's been named Homo habilis. Now, their arms were long like that of an ape, but their brain was twice the size of Australopithecus. Around 1 million years later, another creature arrived called Homo erectus. Their arms were shorter, and their legs were longer, and their brains were larger than that of Homo habilis, which allowed them to invent and use more complex tools. And then, around 200,000 years ago, a creature called Homo sapiens came into existence, whose physical makeup was like that of a modern man, and whose brain was larger than their predecessor, which allowed them to do something that no other animal had ever been able to do before. It's called abstract thinking, which includes being able to comprehend ideas such as mathematics, music, using imagination, and creating art. For this reason, evolutionists point to the development of the brain as an example of how man has not only evolved physically from a lower form of life, but has also evolved intellectually through the same process. However, this is a very simplistic explanation that fails to take into account many other factors. And so let's examine some of them. The brain isn't just a blob of soft tissue. It is so incredibly intricate and complex that we're still learning more about how it works. And the blueprint of how to make this amazing organ is found in the DNA located in every cell of our body. Humans have 23 chromosomes, and each chromosome consists of a great number of genes. Furthermore, each gene is made up of only 4 chemicals, identified by the first letter of their names: A, T, C, and G. But it's the sequence and length of these 4 letters that determines the function of the gene. For example, one gene could be made up as follows: T, A, C, G, G, C, T, whereas another gene could be A, T, C, G, A, G, C, T, T, A. Not only is the sequence of letters different, but the length of the letters is also different. Of the 48,000 genes in the human body, 1/3 of them are devoted to assembling the brain. That's how complex this organ is. When we say that man morphed from being an ape into a human, and his brain grew in size, we're not talking about adding more globs of extra tissue, like adding more lumber to build an addition onto a house. We're talking about adding thousands of new instructions of how to assemble and enlarge a very complex piece of machinery. And those instructions have to be extremely precise. For example, there is one gene located in chromosome number 20 called HAR1, and it's responsible for making the neurons that are located in just the cortex of our brain. This gene tells the cells how to form these neurons, where in the body they're supposed to develop, and what their functions will be. Furthermore, not all neurons are the same, and it is a particular kind of neuron that is located in the cortex of the brain that is responsible for such things as thinking, organizing, planning, and learning. This gene is made up of 180 letters, and there are 18 places in that gene where the letters are different from that of the same gene in an ape. And it is those specific changes that allows humans to think at a higher level than a primate. But it takes more than just adding more neurons to a certain part of the brain. Since each gene is responsible for performing just one specific function, therefore to make a significant change in something as complex as the brain takes making changes in hundreds of other genes at the same time. And all of those changes have to be compatible with one another. To illustrate why, when building a house, the workmen follow a blueprint that tells them how everything is to be put together. Now, you wouldn't find a blueprint calling for a door that opens up into the floor, or have no doors placed on the outside walls, because doors have a very specific function, and therefore have to be put in a very specific location. But it takes intelligence to know that. In the same way, if nature is going to build a larger brain that's capable of performing more functions, there has to be changes made in the old blueprint detailing how the new brain is to be made. This would require changes to be made to hundreds of other genes, and each one of those changes have to be coordinated with the changes in all the other genes. Otherwise, when the body goes to read the blueprint of how to build this new brain, nothing would go together. And in that case, you'd have a brain that couldn't properly work. According to evolutionists, changes in a gene happen randomly and often at unpredictable times. Then how can multiple changes happen almost simultaneously in hundreds of genes so that their combined effect produces a highly complex yet perfectly working organ without some sort of intelligence guiding and directing this process? The theories that evolutionists propose for explaining how nature does this doesn't provide an adequate answer to this question. But the problem is more complex than that. As the brain increases in size, if the brain cavity inside the skull doesn't increase at the same time, then the brain would be squeezed tight inside of it as it grows. Therefore, both the brain and the cavity housing it would have to grow together at the same time and do it in such a way that they both fit together perfectly. As we look at the skulls of each of the 4 different hominins that we've just discussed, we see a marked difference in their shape and size. But the skull has to know what the new brain is going to look like, so it can correctly reshape itself to accommodate the increased size of the brain. But to change the shape of the skull takes hundreds of changes in the genes responsible for creating it. Therefore, all the genes that make the brain must not only coordinate their efforts with each other, but they must also coordinate with all the genes that are responsible for creating the skull. To put this in perspective, that would be like a manufacturing plant adding new machinery to their existing assembly line and having to build a new addition onto their factory to accommodate the extra machinery. That doesn't happen by accident. It takes a lot of thinking, planning, engineering, designing, and mechanical know-how to make all of that happen. Yet evolutionists want us to believe that something far more complicated than a piece of mechanical equipment assembled itself because of a few random, accidental changes in a couple of genes that accumulated over millions of years to account for how the brain doubled in size, giving it greater thinking capacity. And then, at the same exact time, precise changes were also made to the genes that control the size and shape of the skull, so that these 2 very different pieces of the human body just happen to fit together perfectly. Although evolutionists offer explanations of how these changes accumulated over millions of years, yet they lack the fossil and the DNA evidence showing the thousands upon thousands of small steps that had to occur before Homo sapiens came into existence. The explanation often given for this lack of evidence is that those animals whose genes didn't help improve their survivability died off. But there are 2 glaring errors with this theory. The first is that their bones, with their DNA in them, would still be in the ground for us to find and examine. And the second is, if they died off, how did their offspring survive long enough to eventually become a different species? Although evolutionists claim that their conclusions are based on scientific evidence, yet logic would suggest that some form of intelligence is at work in making so many precise changes. At least that would be the obvious conclusion in any other situation where we see clear evidence of intelligence in both design and construction. It is perfectly acceptable to believe in some sort of a superior being while at the same time trying to understand the process he uses to bring about the changes in nature. But that's not what evolutionists do. Instead, they begin with the assumption that there is no intelligence involved in nature, and for this reason, they only look at those selected facts that support the conclusion they want to achieve, while disregarding any facts that contradict their preconceived theories. And this includes their theory that humans came from apes.